There is a word that appeared on the front doors of hundreds of institutions across America, Ireland, England, and Australia. Not the word orphanage, not children's home, not shelter or refuge, or any of the softer terms that charitable organizations typically chose for themselves. The word was industrial. Industrial school, industrial training home, industrial reformatory for children. That word appeared in founding charters, carved above iron gates, printed on government inspection forms, and filed in municipal archives across 4 continents. And for over a century, almost nobody stopped to ask what it actually meant. This is not a minor detail buried in obscure historical footnotes. This is the official name these institutions chose for themselves at the moment of their creation, not a label placed on them later by critics or reformers, not a term invented by historians looking backward with modern judgment. The word industrial was selected deliberately, written into founding documents, and displayed publicly on buildings that housed hundreds of thousands of children over more than a century of operation. That fact alone raises a question that the historical record has never cleanly answered. What was the industry? Who was it serving? And why did that specific word feel like the right choice to the people who built these places? The geography of this pattern is part of what makes it difficult to dismiss. The word did not appear in one country or one tradition. It appeared in Dublin and in Philadelphia. It appeared in Melbourne and in London. It appeared in institutions run by Catholic religious orders, Protestant charitable societies, and municipal government bodies that had no formal connection to each other. Different countries, different religions, different decades of founding, and yet the same word, used in the same way, to describe what were presented as charitable homes for vulnerable children. When something appears this consistently across unconnected organizations in separate countries, there are 2 possible explanations. Either the word carried a shared meaning that everyone at the time understood and accepted, or if the word was performing a specific function that required it to remain consistent. Researchers who began pulling founding charters from archives on both sides of the Atlantic noticed something that moved beyond coincidence. The language across these documents was not simply similar. It was, in many cases, identical. The same phrases appeared in Dublin founding records and in Philadelphia incorporation documents. The same descriptions of purpose, the same stated goals, the same structural language outlining how the institutions would operate. When language travels this precisely across national borders and religious traditions, it suggests something more than parallel thinking. It suggests a shared blueprint. Where that blueprint originated and who was responsible for distributing it is not something the available records explain clearly. Consider what the word industrial does not suggest. It does not suggest warmth. It does not suggest refuge. It does not suggest the kind of language that charitable organizations typically use when presenting themselves to donors and government inspectors. Words like home and refuge and haven were available. Many institutions used them, but the institutions that became the largest, the most funded, and the most widely replicated chose a different word. They chose a word that describes production, a word that describes organized activity oriented toward an output, a word that, in the 19th century, carried a very specific meaning in the context of factories, mills, and commercial operations. That choice was made deliberately, and it was made at the beginning, not added later. Some historians argue that the word was simply the language of its era. The 19th century placed enormous value on productivity and practical training. Charitable organizations that presented themselves as teaching children useful skills were more likely to receive government funding and public donations than organizations that simply provided shelter. The industrial label in this reading was a marketing decision. It told funders that these institutions produced capable workers rather than dependent charity cases. That explanation is reasonable. It fits the historical context, but it does not fully account for why the training programs in these institutions so frequently generated revenue for the institution itself, rather than skills and savings for the children being trained. The records that survive from this period show a pattern that is worth examining carefully. When institutions described their programs in public-facing documents, they used the language of education and training. When the same institutions described their finances in internal records and government grant applications, A different picture appeared. Production quotas, revenue from sold goods, per child income calculations. These were not the records of training programs. These were the records of productive operations. The children inside these compounds were producing goods that were sold in external markets. The income from those sales was retained by the institution. The children received no wage, no share of the proceeds, and in most documented cases, no formal record of the work they had performed. This raises a question that is difficult to answer without making claims the evidence does not fully support. If children were being trained, the training should have left them with skills, savings, or credentials they could use after leaving the institution. What the records show is that children left these institutions with none of those things. They left with the clothes on their backs and, in many cases, no documented history of the years they had spent inside the walls. The training, if that is what it was, did not appear to transfer to the children who received it. It appeared to remain inside the institution, generating ongoing value for the organization that housed them. The physical design of these institutions adds another layer of difficulty to the official explanation. When researchers began locating architectural plans, insurance surveys, and government inspection diagrams, they found that most of these compounds were not single buildings. They were complexes, multiple structures connected by internal corridors and covered walkways. A front building that faced a street and received visitors. Additional buildings behind it that did not appear in public-facing documentation and were not photographed for annual reports. The front building was where inspectors walked. The rear buildings were where the daily operation of the compound actually took place. Whether the inspectors who filed satisfactory reports were unaware of the rear structures, or whether those structures were considered outside the scope of inspection, is not something the inspection records clarify. The founding charters themselves are specific about one thing. These institutions were created to house children who had no other home. That was their stated purpose. And in the context of 19th century urban poverty, that purpose was real and the need was genuine. Cities were growing faster than any government system could manage. Families collapsed. Children ended up on streets with nothing. The institutions that received them were, in many cases, the only available alternative. That context matters. It explains how these compounds grew as large as they did, and why governments funded them without extensive oversight. When the alternative is visible child poverty in public streets, a walled compound with a presentable entrance and satisfactory inspection reports becomes easy to accept without further examination. But the scale of what developed inside those acceptable arrangements is harder to explain through good intentions alone. By the late 19th century, institutions housing between 200 and 900 children were operating in most major cities across Ireland, England, America, and Australia. The same religious congregations frequently managed multiple types of institutions on the same or adjacent plots of land. An industrial school for children, a reformatory for older girls, a laundry attached to the compound and operated as a commercial business. These structures were physically connected. They shared walls, courtyards, and in some documented cases, underground passages. The children in one building and the workers in another occupied the same physical space, separated by internal architecture rather than by any meaningful distance. When you follow the financial connections between these attached structures, the picture that emerges does not match the charitable model the institutions presented publicly. In Ireland, girls who aged out of industrial schools did not typically go into the general workforce. The records show that a significant number transferred directly into the Magdalene laundries, commercial washing operations attached to the same religious compounds that had housed them as children. They spent their adult lives in the same walled environment they had grown up in, now performing paid labor for which they received no wages. The institution that had raised them continued to house them. The laundry they worked in continued to generate revenue. The connection between the children's institution and the commercial operation was not accidental proximity. It was a designed relationship that sustained itself across generations. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. An institution that houses children, trains them in specific types of labor, and then transfers them directly into an attached commercial operation where they continue performing that labor without wages is not describing a charitable training program. It is describing something that functions more like a closed economic system. The children enter at one end, labor exits at the other. The institution collects the revenue and uses a portion of it to fund the intake of the next generation of children. The system sustains itself. And the word printed on the front door, visible to anyone who passed on the street, described exactly this arrangement. Industrial. This is where the explanation becomes difficult. Not because the evidence is unclear, but because the evidence is consistent in ways that the official account does not fully address. Identical language across unconnected institutions. Identical architectural layouts across different countries. Financial structures that generated institutional revenue from children's labor. Transfer pipelines that moved individuals from children's institutions directly into attached commercial operations. These are not isolated facts that require creative interpretation to connect. They appear in founding documents, architectural surveys, financial records, and government reports. They were never hidden from public view. They were simply never examined together. Some researchers believe the consistency across these institutions reflects deliberate coordination, that the industrial model was designed as a system and distributed through networks of religious organizations and government contacts who understood its economic function. Others argue that the similarities reflect independent convergence around a model that governments found easy to fund and religious organizations found easy to operate. Whether the system was engineered or emerged, the outcomes it produced were consistent enough across countries and decades to suggest that the word on the front door was never simply a description of charitable intent. What sits in the archives is the word itself, still printed on founding documents that municipal record offices have retained without commentary, still visible in the language of government grant applications that describe per-child funding calculations, still present in the names carved above iron gates on buildings that now house offices, apartments, and art colleges. The word was chosen at the moment of creation. It described something specific, and the question of what it actually described, what industry was operating inside those walls, who it served, and where its revenues went, remains, based on the available record, not fully answered. The founding charters exist. The financial records that survive are partial. The architectural plans that remain are incomplete, and the buildings that still stand have had their internal passages filled with concrete and their institutional signage removed from walls that have since been painted over and repurposed. But the word in the founding charter has not been changed. It remains exactly as it was written. Industrial, whatever that meant then, and whatever it was intended to accomplish. The people who built these places believed it was the right word. They were precise enough in their language to use it identically across 4 continents. That precision suggests they knew what they were describing. The question is whether we have been willing, until recently, to read it the same way they wrote it. The accepted explanation for what these institutions were and why they existed is, on the surface, quite straightforward. It begins with a simple historical fact. The 19th century was a period of enormous social disruption across the Western world. Cities were expanding at a pace that no government had anticipated and no existing system was prepared to handle. People moved from rural areas into urban centers looking for work. Factories opened. Populations concentrated. And alongside that growth came poverty on a scale that was impossible to ignore. Children were part of that poverty. Visibly, publicly, undeniably part of it. The streets of cities like London, Dublin, Philadelphia, and Melbourne carried children who had no home, no parent, and no institution waiting to receive them. Some had lost parents to disease. Some had lost them to industrial accidents. Some came from families that had simply collapsed under the weight of debt and hunger and displacement. Whatever the specific cause, the result was the same. Children living without shelter, without food, and without any adult responsible for their welfare. This was not a hidden problem in the 19th century. It was one of the most discussed social issues of the era. Newspapers wrote about it. Politicians debated it. Religious organizations preached about it from pulpits in every major city across the English-speaking world. Into that gap, 2 types of organizations stepped forward: religious institutions and private charitable societies. Both had existing infrastructure. Both had public legitimacy. Both had access to donor networks that governments of that period lacked. And both began, often independently and in different countries, building the same solution: walled compounds outside city centers, large residential buildings capable of housing hundreds of children at once, facilities that could receive children with no questions about origin, no requirement for parental documentation, and no fixed timeline for discharge. These institutions opened quickly because the need was real and the resources, for a time, were available. That much is not disputed by any serious historian of the period. The industrial label attached to so many of these institutions had an explanation that the organizations themselves offered openly and consistently. Teaching children practical skills, they argued, was more valuable than simply providing shelter. A child who left the institution knowing how to sew, or farm, or operate a printing press, was a child who could find work and support themselves in adult life. This was presented not as an economic argument, but as a moral one. Idleness, in the thinking of that era, was considered a pathway to poverty and criminality. Structure and labor were considered pathways to virtue and self-sufficiency. The industrial training model was therefore framed as a gift, a preparation for life that orphaned or abandoned children would not otherwise have received. Government bodies found this argument persuasive, and the reason they found it persuasive matters. Governments in this period were not equipped to run large residential institutions for children. They lacked the administrative capacity, the physical infrastructure, and the trained personnel. Religious organizations had all three. They had buildings, staff drawn from religious orders, who required no salary beyond basic provisions, and established relationships with donor communities that could supplement government funding. Partnering with these organizations to house and train poor children was, from a government perspective, an efficient solution to a visible social problem. The per-child grant system that developed in countries like Ireland and England formalized this partnership. Governments paid a fixed amount for each child housed. Institutions received that funding and were expected to provide care and training in return. Inspectors were appointed to verify that the arrangement was functioning, and many of those inspectors filed reports that confirmed, at least on the surface, that it was. Clean dining halls appeared in inspection photographs. Organized daily schedules appeared in inspection notes. Adequate food supplies were recorded. Children appeared to be clothed and housed. The reports that survive from this period in government archives describe institutions that were, by the standards of their time, operating within acceptable parameters. Some inspectors noted problems. Some filed critical reports. But the overall picture presented by the official inspection record is one of a rough system doing a difficult job in difficult circumstances, with results that were imperfect but not fundamentally dishonest. That is the accepted version, and it is important to understand it clearly before examining anything else. The argument is not that these institutions were perfect. Nobody who has studied the period makes that claim. The argument is that they were a genuine response to a genuine crisis, operating within a historical context that offered no cleaner alternatives. Removing children from dangerous streets and placing them in structured residential institutions where they received food, shelter, and practical training was, in this reading, a reasonable thing for charitable organizations to do in the 19th century. Judging that arrangement by modern standards, the argument continues, misses the point. Different times operated by different standards, and by the standards of those times, the official record suggests the system worked. Some historians go further. They argue that the institutions should be understood primarily as products of their era, reflecting values and assumptions that were widespread across society rather than unique to the organizations that built them. Child labor, for example, was not invented by orphanages. It was common across all levels of society in the 19th century. Children from working-class families labored in fields, mills, and domestic service from young ages. The children inside institutional walls were not being treated in a way that was dramatically different from children outside them. They were being treated according to the norms of their time. That context, this argument holds, is essential to any honest evaluation of what these institutions were and what they did. The religious organizations that ran the majority of these compounds also had their own explanations, stated clearly in their own publications and annual reports. They described their work as a form of mission, taking in the most vulnerable children, providing them not only with material care, but with moral and spiritual formation. The daily schedules that inspectors noted were not simply about keeping children occupied. They were designed, according to the institution's own statements, to build character. Prayer, labor, education, and discipline were understood as interconnected parts of a system intended to produce stable, virtuous adults from children who had started life with nothing. This framing was accepted by governments, by donor communities, and by the general public for most of the century in which these institutions operated. At first, it seems normal. A society facing a visible crisis builds institutions to manage it. Those institutions present themselves as charitable and educational. Governments fund them. Inspectors monitor them. The public donates to them. Religious organizations staff them. Everyone involved believes, or at least states publicly, that the arrangement serves the children inside it. This is a coherent picture. It has internal logic. It matches the documentary record that survives in government archives and institutional publications. And for a long time, it was the only picture most people had access to, because it was the only picture that was being produced and preserved. But this is where it becomes unclear. The inspection record that forms the backbone of the official explanation has a structural problem that researchers began identifying when they looked more carefully at how inspections actually worked. Inspectors visited institutions. That is documented. They filed reports. Those reports survive. But what those reports consistently describe is the front of the institution, the dining hall, the dormitories visible from the main entrance, the classrooms where children sat during scheduled hours. What the inspection reports do not consistently describe is what lay behind those visible spaces. The workshops, the attached commercial operations, the rear buildings that architectural surveys later revealed were connected to the main structure by internal passages. Inspectors saw what they were shown. Whether they were aware that more existed behind what they were shown is not something the inspection record itself makes clear. The funding model also deserves closer examination than the official explanation typically gives it. Per-child grants sound like a straightforward reimbursement system. Governments pay institutions to house children. Institutions use that money to provide care. But the per-child calculation created an incentive that the accepted explanation tends to minimize. More children meant more funding. This was not a theoretical incentive. It was a mathematical reality built into the system from the beginning. An institution housing 200 children received twice the government grant of an institution housing 100. The pressure to fill beds and to keep them filled was structural. It existed regardless of the intentions of the individuals running the institutions, and whether that pressure influenced admission decisions, whether children were kept longer than necessary, or admitted on weaker grounds than the official criteria required, is something the surviving records do not answer with any consistency. The practical skills argument also becomes more complicated when examined against the records of what happened to children after they left these institutions. If the industrial training model was genuinely preparing children for independent working life, there should be evidence of that preparation producing results. Former residents should appear in employment records, in marriage records, in census data, as individuals who built stable lives using the skills they acquired inside the institution. Some did. That is documented. But the pattern is uneven in ways that the official explanation does not fully address. A significant number of former residents of industrial schools appear in records not as independent workers, but as residents of other institutions, workhouses, reformatories, and in Ireland, the Magdalene laundries attached to the same religious compounds that had housed them as children. The training, in those cases, did not appear to have produced independent adults. It appeared to have produced individuals who remained inside institutional systems for the rest of their lives. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. An institution that trains children in specific types of labor and then releases them directly into attached facilities, where they continue performing that same labor, is not describing a preparation for life in the outside world. It is describing a closed system that retains its population across different institutional categories. The child enters one building. The adult enters the next one. The institution collects funding at every stage. Whether this outcome was intended or simply emerged from the structure of the system is a question the accepted explanation does not clearly resolve. Some believe the transfer pattern was coincidental, driven by economic necessity and a lack of alternatives for people with no family network to return to. Others disagree, pointing to the consistent physical and administrative connections between the children's institutions and the facilities that received their former residents as adults. The official explanation, taken as a whole, rests on a foundation that is real but partial. The poverty was genuine. The need was genuine. The religious organizations that stepped forward had real infrastructure and, in many cases, real conviction about the value of their work. The government funding model made practical sense in a period when governments lacked direct capacity to manage the problem themselves. The inspection system produced records that, read in isolation, described something functional. All of that is true, and none of it fully accounts for what the records also show when they are read together rather than separately. The financial structures, the architectural layouts, the transfer patterns, the gaps in the inspection record. The official explanation covers the front of the institution. What it covers less completely is everything behind it. And that gap between what the explanation addresses and what the records contain is where the questions remain open. But this is where it becomes unclear. The official explanation for these institutions rested on one central argument. Industrial training prepared children for working life. That argument was repeated in founding charters, annual reports, government submissions, and donor communications across multiple countries and multiple decades. It was the justification that made the entire system acceptable to governments that funded it and publics that donated to it. Training children in practical skills was understood as a form of charity, a gift of capability to children who had nothing. And on the surface, that argument is not unreasonable. Teaching a child a trade is genuinely useful. A skill acquired young can support a person for decades. The training argument made sense. The problem is that the records do not consistently support it. There is a straightforward way to test whether a training program is genuinely oriented toward the person being trained. You follow the output. In a real apprenticeship, the apprentice acquires a skill and eventually uses that skill independently. The work they perform during training builds toward something that belongs to them. Their labor has a direction. It moves toward their future. This is the defining feature of genuine vocational training. The benefit accumulates to the trainee. When you apply that test to the records left behind by institutions that describe themselves as industrial training homes, something does not align. The output of the children's labor did not accumulate to the children. It accumulated to the institution. The New York Juvenile Asylum provides one of the clearest documented examples of this pattern. The institution was founded in 1851 and housed hundreds of children at any given time. Its own annual reports, which survive in archival collections and have been examined by researchers, describe the daily operation of the institution in considerable detail. Boys inside the asylum made shoes. That fact appears clearly in the records. But the records do not stop there. They continue to describe what happened to those shoes after they were made. The institution sold them, and the reports go further still. They record the profit generated by that sale. $4 to $6 per day. That figure was not buried in a footnote. It was recorded in the annual reports with what can only be described as institutional satisfaction. The labor of the boys was generating measurable revenue, and that revenue belonged to the institution. At first, it seems normal. Children learning a trade, products being made, a self-sufficient institution operating efficiently. But there's a problem. The profit from the shoes did not go to the boys who made them. It did not go into savings accounts that would be available to them when they left. It did not fund tools or materials they could take with them. It went into the institution's operating budget. The boys received no wage, no share, no record in their personal files acknowledging that their labor had produced value. They made shoes. The institution sold shoes. The transaction between those two facts, the making and the selling, passed entirely through the institution, leaving nothing in the hands of the children who had done the work. This raises questions that the training explanation does not answer cleanly. If the purpose was to teach shoemaking as a skill, the boys who spent years making shoes inside that asylum should have left as trained cobblers. Some may have, but the records do not consistently show former residents entering the shoemaking trade or any other skilled craft after discharge. What the records show is production. Consistent, organized, revenue-generating production. The distinction matters. A training program produces skilled individuals. A production operation produces goods and revenue. The records from the New York Juvenile Asylum describe the second of those two things, while using the language of the first. The girls inside the same institution present a different but equally telling pattern. They were not assigned to the shoe workshop. They were trained exclusively in domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, laundering, household service. These are practical skills, and the institution framed them as such. But the framing used in the annual reports to describe the girls' training is noticeably different from the language used to describe the boys. The boys' labor was described in financial terms: revenue generated, profit per day, dollar figures attached to their output. The girls' training was described in moral terms. The reports stated that it made them useful and virtuous, not skilled, not prepared for independent employment. Useful and virtuous. Those are not economic descriptions. They are character descriptions. And the difference between how the institution described male labor and female labor in its own records is not a minor linguistic variation. It reflects two different understandings of what the labor was for. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If industrial training was a unified program designed to prepare all children for working life, the language describing that program should be broadly consistent. Skills acquired, trades learned, capacities developed. But the records use one set of terms for boys and a different set for girls. Boys produce revenue. Girls acquire virtue. That difference in language suggests that the two programs had different purposes. The boys' program was oriented toward production. The girls' program was oriented toward a particular type of social conditioning. Neither description matches what a genuine vocational training model would look like for either group. The annual reports that contained these descriptions were not internal documents. They were published and distributed to donors and government bodies. The revenue figures and the moral language appeared side by side in documents intended for public consumption. Nobody who read those reports at the time appears to have questioned the gap between the two frameworks. The boys generated profit. The girls were made virtuous. Both were described as receiving industrial training. The word covered both arrangements simultaneously, which raises its own question. What exactly did industrial mean if it could describe both a revenue-generating shoe workshop and a domestic conditioning program without any apparent contradiction? Some researchers believe the answer is straightforward. The word industrial in the 19th century carried a broad meaning that encompassed any organized, structured activity applied to children's institutions. It simply meant that children's time was organized around work rather than idleness. Others disagree. They point to the financial records and argue that the word was doing something more specific. It was providing a legitimate label for operations that were, in economic terms, closer to production facilities than to training programs. The debate between these two interpretations has not been resolved, partly because the institutions themselves never defined the term with any precision. They used it. They did not explain it. The revenue question extends beyond the New York Juvenile Asylum. It appears in the records of institutions across multiple countries. In England, similar institutions produced goods that were sold in local markets. In Ireland, the commercial operations attached to industrial schools generated income that flowed into the same religious organizations managing the children's facilities. The pattern of children's labor producing institutional revenue was not a local anomaly. It was a consistent feature of the industrial institution model as it operated across the Western world during this period. And that consistency is what makes the training explanation increasingly difficult to sustain as a complete account of what these institutions were doing. However, the timeline does not fully match the training model in another important way. Genuine apprenticeships in the 19th century had defined durations. A child entered a trade apprenticeship at a specific age, worked under a master craftsman for a defined period, and was released at the end of that period as a qualified practitioner. The duration was tied to the acquisition of skill. When the skill was acquired, the apprenticeship ended. The records from industrial institutions do not consistently show this pattern. Children entered these compounds at young ages and remained for years without a clear point at which their training was considered complete. Some remained until they aged out of the children's institution entirely, at which point they frequently transferred to adult facilities run by the same organizations. The training, in those cases, never appeared to reach a conclusion. It simply continued in a different institutional setting under a different institutional label. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A training program with no defined completion point is not functioning as a training program. It is functioning as an ongoing arrangement. The children's labor was not building toward a moment of release into independent skilled work. It was sustaining a continuous operation that required their presence to function. When children left, new children arrived to fill the same roles. The shoes continued to be made. The domestic work continued to be performed. The institution's revenue stream continued to flow. The individual children were interchangeable within the operation. Their training, if that is what it was, produced no lasting individual credential. It produced a continuous supply of labor for an institution that depended on that labor to operate. The language used in institutional records deserves one more careful examination. Annual reports from institutions, like the New York Juvenile Asylum, were carefully written documents. They were composed by administrators who understood that these reports would be read by donors and government officials. The decision to record the boys' labor as generating $4 to $6 per day in profit was a deliberate choice. That figure did not have to appear in a public document. It appeared because the institution considered it a positive fact worth sharing. Revenue generation was something they were proud of, or at least comfortable acknowledging. The fact that they recorded it openly, without apparent concern that it might contradict the training narrative, suggests something about how those running the institution understood their own operation. They did not appear to see any contradiction between describing their work as charitable training and simultaneously reporting the profit their children's labor produced. Those two things coexisted in their own accounting without apparent tension. And this is where the records become most interesting, not because they reveal something hidden, but because they reveal something that was never hidden at all. The revenue figures were in the public reports. The moral language was in the public reports. The distinction between how boys' labor and girls' labor was described was in the public reports. None of this was concealed. It was recorded, published, and submitted to government bodies. The question is not whether this information existed. The question is why the gap between the training explanation and the financial reality it sat beside was never examined more closely by the people who read those reports at the time. The documents were available. The figures were clear. The language was specific. The gap between what the institutions claimed to be doing and what their own records showed they were doing was present in the same pages of the same annual reports. It simply was not questioned. And the reason it was not questioned, whether that was a product of the era's assumptions, the authority of the religious organizations involved, or some other factor entirely, is something the records themselves do not explain. To understand how these institutions grew as large as they did, and as quickly as they did, it helps to look beyond the charitable explanations and examine the financial structure that was built around them. Systems grow when they are funded, and the funding model attached to these institutions created conditions that encourage growth in ways that the official charitable narrative does not fully account for. In Ireland, the mechanism was straightforward. Institutions received government grants calculated on a per-child basis. Each child housed inside the walls represented a fixed payment from government funds. The more children an institution held, the more money it received each quarter. That is a simple equation, and simple equations produce predictable behavior. The per-child funding model was not unique to Ireland. Versions of it operated in England, in parts of the United States, and in Australia during the same period. Governments across the Western world had decided that paying institutions to house poor children was more efficient than building and operating their own facilities. That decision made practical sense, given the administrative limitations of 19th century governments, but it created an incentive structure that deserves careful examination. When an institution's income is directly tied to the number of children it houses, the institution has a financial interest in keeping that number high. Full beds mean more funding. Empty beds mean less. That is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how the funding model functioned mathematically. Some historians who have studied this period note that the per-child funding model did more than simply reward large institutions. It created pressure to admit children on weaker grounds than the official criteria required. The stated purpose of these institutions was to house orphans and abandoned children. Children who had no parent, no family, and no alternative. That was the population these institutions were built for, and it was the population that justified the government funding. But the financial incentive pointed in a different direction. It pointed toward maximizing occupancy regardless of whether the specific children being admitted truly met the criteria of having no alternative. This raises a question that the official record does not cleanly answer. How many of the children inside these institutions were genuine orphans? The answer, when researchers began cross-referencing institutional admission records against census data and death records from the same period, was more complicated than the institution's own description suggested. A significant number of children housed inside these compounds had at least one living parent. In some cases, both parents were alive. The reason for admission was not the death of a parent. It was poverty. A family too poor to feed and clothe a child could surrender that child to an institution. The institution received government money for housing that child. The child was counted among the institution's population, and the distinction between a genuine orphan and a child surrendered due to poverty was not always clearly reflected in the records the institution submitted to government bodies. At first, it seems normal. Poverty and orphanhood often overlap. A family in genuine crisis may have no practical choice but to surrender a child to institutional care. The institution provides food and shelter that the family cannot. From a purely practical standpoint, that arrangement can be understood as a form of emergency social support, and some historians argue that it should be understood in exactly those terms. The institutions were absorbing children that an overwhelmed society had no other system to handle. The fact that some of those children had living parents did not necessarily make the arrangement exploitative. It may simply reflect the absence of any alternative support structure for families in extreme poverty. But this is where it becomes unclear. If the arrangement was understood as temporary emergency support, the record should show a consistent pattern of children returning to their families once those families stabilized. Poverty is not always permanent. Economic circumstances change. Parents recover from illness. Families relocate and find work. A genuine emergency support system would show movement in both directions. Children entering during crisis. Children returning when the crisis passed. The records from industrial institutions in Ireland and England do not consistently show that pattern. What they show more often is children entering the system and remaining inside it. Not for months, for years, sometimes for the entirety of their childhood. The reclamation records are particularly difficult to interpret. Some parents did attempt to reclaim their children after surrendering them to institutional care. Those attempts appear in institutional records and, in some cases, in court documents. What those records also show is that reclamation was not straightforward. Institutions did not always cooperate with parental requests to return children. In documented cases, institutions refused reclamation attempts on grounds that the parent could not demonstrate sufficient financial stability to care for the child. That standard sounds reasonable, but it is worth examining who was setting that standard and who was applying it. The institution receiving government money for each child it housed was also the institution making the judgment about whether a parent was financially capable of reclaiming their child. That is a situation where the financial interest of the institution and the stated welfare interest of the child pointed in the same direction. Keeping the child inside the walls served both. Some believe that institutional resistance to reclamation was genuinely motivated by concern for children's welfare. The argument is that institutions had seen too many cases of children returned to unstable homes and then surrendered again, or worse, left to fend for themselves without any support. Caution about reclamation, in this reading, reflected experience rather than financial calculation. Others disagree. They point to cases where parents with demonstrably stable circumstances were still denied reclamation, and where the institutional records documenting those denials focus more on procedural grounds than on genuine assessments of child welfare. The truth of individual cases varies, but the pattern across many cases raises questions that a purely charitable explanation does not resolve. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The per-child funding model, the admission of children with living parents, and the resistance to reclamation are three separate facts. Each one, taken individually, can be explained within the charitable framework. Funding models are administrative necessities. Poverty creates genuine need regardless of whether parents are alive. Institutions exercising caution about returning children to unstable homes reflects protective instinct. But when those three facts are placed alongside each other and read as a connected pattern, a different picture begins to form. A picture of a system that had financial incentives to grow, mechanisms for admitting children beyond its stated orphan population, and institutional practices that made exit from the system difficult once entry had occurred. The census data from Ireland during the peak decades of industrial school operation adds another layer to this picture. Researchers who have compared institutional population figures against general population data have noted that the number of children inside these compounds significantly exceeded what the orphan population of the same period would suggest. Ireland experienced genuine tragedy during the 19th century. Famine, disease, and immigration disrupted families on a massive scale. The orphan population was real and significant, but the institutional population appears to have grown beyond what that orphan pool alone could account for. The gap between the documented orphan population and the institutional headcount points toward the admission of children who did not meet the strict definition of orphans. Whether that gap reflects genuine emergency need or institutional incentive to maximize occupancy is something the records do not resolve with precision. The government bodies that funded this system were not unaware of the per-child incentive. The structure of the grants was not secret. It was established policy, debated in parliamentary records and government reports. What is less clear is whether those bodies examined the consequences of that incentive with any rigor. Government inspection reports focused on conditions inside institutions. They assessed whether children were fed, housed, and clothed adequately. They did not consistently examine whether children should have been inside the institutions in the first place. The question of admission criteria was largely left to the institutions themselves, and the institutions, whose income depended on occupancy, were the least well-positioned entities to apply those criteria without conflict of interest. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A system in which the organization receiving funding for housing children is also the organization making admission decisions is a system with the structural problem that exists regardless of the intentions of the individuals operating it. It does not require bad faith to produce problematic outcomes. It requires only that financial incentive and decision-making authority be held by the same body without adequate external oversight. The inspection system that governments maintained was designed to check conditions, not admissions. It looked at what was happening inside the walls. It did not consistently examine who was inside the walls and whether they should be. The records that document parental surrender also reveal something about the power dynamics involved in these transactions. When a family in poverty surrendered a child to an institution, the transaction was not between equals. The institution had legal standing, administrative resources, government backing, and the authority to house the child. The parent had none of those things. They had poverty. The surrender documents that survive in institutional archives are typically brief. They record the child's name, age, and the date of admission. They do not consistently record the circumstances of the surrender in detail. They do not record whether the parent understood the implications of signing. They do not record whether alternatives were offered or discussed. The document that transferred custody of a child from a parent to an institution was a legal instrument, but it was created and administered by the institution receiving the child. The parent's understanding of what they were signing and what rights they retained afterward is something the records rarely address. However, the timeline does not fully match the emergency support model in another important way. If these institutions were responding to acute poverty crises, their populations should have fluctuated with economic conditions. During periods of relative economic stability, admissions should have declined. During periods of acute poverty, admissions should have risen sharply. Some fluctuation does appear in the records, But the overall trend across the peak decades of industrial school operation was consistent growth, independent of economic cycles. Institutions grew larger during both difficult and relatively stable periods. That pattern is more consistent with a system expanding to capture available funding than with a system scaling its response to genuine need. The funding was available, the incentive was present, and the system grew accordingly. The question that sits underneath all of this is not whether poverty was real. It was. The question is whether the system built to respond to that poverty was designed primarily around the needs of the children it housed, or around something else. The financial architecture of per-child grants, the admission patterns that extended beyond the orphan population, the institutional resistance to reclamation, and the consistent growth of the system across varying economic conditions all point toward a structure that served institutional interests alongside, and in some cases ahead of, the interests of the children inside it. Whether that was the result of deliberate design or the unintended consequence of a poorly structured funding model is a question the available records do not answer with certainty. What they do show is that the system grew. It grew large. It grew quickly. And it grew in ways that the charitable explanation, taken alone, does not fully account for. When researchers began mapping the physical layouts of these institutions, they were not looking for anything unusual. The initial goal was straightforward. Locate the architectural plans, the insurance surveys, the inspection diagrams, and the building records that documented how these compounds were constructed and arranged. This was standard historical research, the kind that produces useful background information about scale and capacity. How many dormitories? How many dining halls? How many children a given building could hold at one time? That was the expected finding. What the records actually showed was something different, and the difference was not subtle. These institutions were not single buildings. That fact alone changes the picture considerably. When most people think of an orphanage or a children's home from this period, they imagine one large building, a main hall, perhaps a chapel attached to one side, a garden or yard at the back. That image comes partly from the photographs that survive from this era, and those photographs almost universally show the same thing. The front of the main building, the entrance, the reception area, the spaces that were designed to be seen. What those photographs do not show is what stood behind the building they were documenting. And what stood behind it, in institution after institution across multiple countries, was more building, more structure, more operational space, connected to the front building by internal corridors and covered passages that did not appear on any public-facing plan. The term that more accurately describes these places is compound, not building, not home. Compound, a walled complex of multiple structures arranged around internal courtyards, connected by covered walkways, and, in some documented cases, by underground passages. The wall itself is significant. These institutions were not open facilities, where children could walk out to a street and return. They were enclosed environments with defined perimeters that controlled movement in and out. The wall was not incidental to the design. It was a fundamental feature of it. And the question of what the wall was primarily for, whether it was keeping the outside world from coming in or keeping the children from going out, is one that the architectural record does not answer directly. The front building of these compounds served a specific and well-documented function. It was the public face of the institution. It contained the spaces that donors visited, that inspectors photographed, and that annual reports described. The reception hall, where charitable fundraising events were held. The dining room that appeared in government inspection photographs with long tables and adequate place settings. The chapel that demonstrated the institution's religious character and moral mission. These spaces were real. The food in the dining hall was real. The chapel services were real. The inspectors who visited and filed satisfactory reports were looking at real conditions in real rooms. The front building was not a fabrication. It was a carefully maintained presentation of the institution's most visible functions. But this is where it becomes unclear. The front building was not the whole institution. Behind it, connected by passages that did not appear on the plans submitted to government offices or displayed in promotional materials, stood additional structures. In some compounds, a second building of comparable size to the first. In others, a third. These rear structures are documented in insurance surveys, in private architectural records, and in the accounts of former residents. They are not documented in the inspection reports that government bodies use to evaluate institutional performance. The inspectors visited. They described what they saw. But the rear buildings, the structures where the operational activity of the compound actually took place, appear in the inspection record only rarely and incompletely. The Good Shepherd Institution in Limerick, Ireland, provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples of this compound architecture. It operated on a single plot of land from 1848 to 1990, more than a century of continuous operation on one site. And on that site, across those decades, the following structures existed simultaneously: a commercial laundry, an industrial school for children, a reformatory school for girls, an orphanage, a convent housing the religious sisters who ran the operation, and a church. 6 distinct institutional functions operating within the same walled perimeter. The diversity of functions on that single plot raises an immediate question. How did these different populations, children in the orphanage, girls in the reformatory, women working in the laundry, and the religious community in the convent, occupy the same physical space without constant interaction? The answer, documented in the architectural record, is that they did not interact. They were kept separated by the design of the compound itself. The underground tunnels at the Good Shepherd Institution in Limerick are not a rumor or a later reconstruction. They are documented in the records of the building's conversion into an art college. When architects began that conversion process, they encountered the tunnels as physical features of the site, passages running beneath the courtyard level, connecting different sections of the compound. Their purpose, given the layout of the buildings they connected, appears to have been movement. Specifically, the movement of people or goods between the residential sections and the commercial laundry without passing through open courtyards where those movements would be visible. Whether the tunnels were used to move children, to move laundry, or to allow personnel to travel between buildings without being seen from outside the walls is something the available records do not specify precisely. What the records do specify is that when the conversion project was complete, the tunnels were filled with concrete. The architect noted that there was no reason to retain them. That phrase is the only explanation offered in the documented record for a decision that permanently destroyed evidence of how the compound's different sections were physically connected. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The decision to fill the tunnels rather than simply seal them or leave them empty is a practical choice. Filled tunnels are more stable. They do not create voids beneath a building being actively renovated. The structural argument for filling them is reasonable, but the result of filling them is that the physical evidence of how different sections of the compound were connected is now permanently inaccessible. Whatever the tunnels were used for, whatever passed through them during more than a century of institutional operation, that information cannot now be recovered from the physical structure. The architectural record ends at the concrete. What the tunnels contained before that concrete was poured exists only in documents that may or may not have survived, and in the accounts of people who were inside the compound during its operational decades. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The compound model, with its front building presenting one face to the public and its rear structures operating outside the inspection record, creates an evidential problem that researchers continue to encounter. The inspection reports describe the front building. The front building was real and in many cases genuinely adequate, but the inspection reports were the primary basis on which governments evaluated institutional performance and continued funding. If the inspection process did not consistently examine the rear structures, and the architectural evidence suggests it did not, then the official record of these institutions is necessarily incomplete. It describes part of the compound, not all of it. And the part it does not describe is the part where the operational functions, the labor, the commercial activity, the connections between different institutional populations, were actually taking place. Some researchers argue that the compound architecture reflects practical necessity rather than intentional concealment. Large institutions needed large physical plants. A laundry requires industrial equipment and space that cannot be accommodated in a residential building. A school requires classrooms. A convent requires chapel space and private residential quarters for the religious community. The compound model in this reading simply reflects the space requirements of multiple institutional functions operating on the same site. The underground passages were utility connections, not concealment mechanisms. The rear buildings were operational annexes, not hidden facilities. The architecture was functional, not deceptive. Others disagree. They point to the consistent absence of rear structures from public-facing documentation, not just at the Limerick institution, but across dozens of similar compounds in Ireland, England, and elsewhere. Functional annexes do not typically disappear from architectural plans submitted to government offices. Utility passages do not typically get omitted from inspection diagrams. The gap between the compound's actual layout and its publicly documented layout requires an explanation that the purely functional argument does not provide. The public-facing plans for many of these institutions are still held in municipal archives. Researchers who have located them and compared them to the insurance surveys and private architectural records that document the full compound layout have found consistent discrepancies. Buildings that appear in insurance records do not appear on the plans submitted to government bodies. Courtyards that insurance surveys show as enclosed operational spaces appear on public plans as open garden areas. The discrepancies are not always dramatic, but they are consistent. And consistency across multiple institutions in multiple countries suggests something more than individual administrative oversight or record-keeping variation. However, the timeline does not fully match a simple administrative explanation in another respect. These institutions operated for decades. Many operated for more than a century. During that time, they were inspected repeatedly. They submitted annual reports. They applied for and received government grants. The opportunity for the rear buildings and connecting passages to appear in official documentation existed across hundreds of inspection cycles. The fact that they consistently did not appear raises a question that the administrative explanation does not answer satisfactorily. Either the inspectors consistently failed to examine the full compound, or the information about the full compound was consistently not provided to them. Both possibilities are troubling in different ways. One suggests a failure of the inspection system. The other suggests something more deliberate. The former residents of these compounds, whose accounts have been recorded in government investigations and survivor testimonies, describe the rear buildings in detail. The washhouses, the workshops, the spaces where labor took place that the inspection photographs did not show. Their accounts are consistent across institutions and across decades. They describe compounds that functioned very differently from the front buildings that inspectors documented. The spaces described in survivor testimony and the spaces described in inspection reports overlap in some areas and diverge significantly in others. Where they diverge, the divergence is not random. It follows the same pattern. The inspected spaces were the presentable ones. The uninspected spaces were the operational ones. What the architectural record leaves behind is a physical argument. These compounds were designed with specific layouts. Those layouts included structures that were not publicly documented. The connections between those structures, the corridors and passages, and in some cases tunnels, were built deliberately and removed deliberately. The removal, when it occurred, was described as having no reason to be avoided, and that phrase, offered casually in an architect's notes about a renovation project, may be the most precise summary of how the second building was treated throughout the entire history of these institutions. There was no reason to retain what the tunnels connected. There was no reason to document what the rear buildings contained. There was no reason to include them in inspection photographs or public architectural plans. The compound told its full story only in the physical space of the site itself. And that space, in Limerick and in many places like it, has since been renovated, repurposed, and built over. What remains is the outline. The wall still stands in some locations. The courtyard dimensions are still visible in satellite surveys. The front building still faces the street, with its original stonework intact. But the passages that connected it to everything behind it are filled with concrete now. And the record of what passed through them is somewhere in the gap between the front building's careful documentation and the rear building's consistent silence. The Artane Industrial School in Dublin is one of the most thoroughly documented institutions of its kind in the historical record. It operated for nearly a century, from 1870 to 1969. It sat behind a walled perimeter on the north side of Dublin, and at its peak, it housed nearly 1,000 boys inside those walls. 1,000. That figure is not an estimate drawn from incomplete records. It appears in the institution's own documentation and in government reports from the same period. Nearly 1,000 boys living, working, and growing up inside a single-walled compound, under the supervision of the Christian Brothers, with no wage, no independent movement, and no family structure to mediate between them and the institution that controlled every hour of their day. The institution described itself in public communications with a word that appeared consistently across its official documentation. That word was self-sufficient. Artane, according to its own reports, was a self-sufficient operation. The boys made their own clothes. They grew their own food on the institutional farmland attached to the compound. They stitched their own shoes. They operated their own printing press. They produced, according to the institutional record, essentially everything required for the compound's daily operation. This was presented not as an observation, but as an achievement. The word self-sufficient appeared in official reports with what can only be described as institutional pride. A large residential facility that did not depend on external supply chains was, in the administrative language of the period, an efficiently run operation. And efficiency was considered a virtue. At first, it seems normal. A large institution producing its own food, clothing, and printed materials reduces its dependence on external suppliers and controls its operating costs. That is a straightforward administrative advantage. Many large institutions of the period, including hospitals and military establishments, operated with similar internal production systems. The self-sufficiency model was not unusual in that general sense. But there is a problem. The word self-sufficient describes an outcome. It describes what the institution produced and consumed in relation to each other. It does not describe the purpose behind that arrangement, and it does not answer the question that becomes unavoidable once the scale of the operation is considered clearly. Nearly 1,000 boys producing food, clothing, shoes, and printed material inside a walled compound. What happened when they produced more than they needed? This is not a hypothetical question. It is a practical one with a documentable answer. Institutions that produce goods have outputs. Those outputs either stay inside the institution or they leave it. If they stay inside, the institution accumulates surplus. If they leave, they enter a market. The records from Artane and from similar institutions during the same period show that production did not stop at the level of internal need. The printing press at Artane produced material beyond what the institution itself required. The farmland produced food beyond what nearly 1,000 boys consumed. The shoe workshop produced footwear beyond what the residents wore. The excess went somewhere, and the records that document where it went describe a consistent pattern. Surplus production was sold. The revenue from those sales returned to the institution. The boys who produced the surplus received no portion of that revenue. No wage, no credit, no record in their personal files acknowledging that their labor had generated income for the compound that housed them. But this is where it becomes unclear. The institution's own language for this arrangement was not commercial. It was educational. Official reports filed with government bodies described the boys' activities as training. The farming was agricultural training. The printing was vocational training. The shoemaking was trade training. Each productive activity was framed as a form of education rather than a form of labor. And that framing matters enormously, because the legal and moral obligations attached to education are entirely different from those attached to labor. An institution educating children is not required to compensate them for their participation in that education. An institution extracting productive labor from children and selling the results in a market is operating under a very different set of obligations. The choice of the word training rather than work was not a neutral descriptive decision. It was a categorization that determined what the institution owed the children inside it. The government offices that received these reports accepted the educational framing without sustained challenge for nearly a century. That acceptance is itself a fact worth examining. Government inspectors visited Artane. They observed the farming, the printing, the shoemaking. They filed reports. Those reports used the same language the institution used. Training, Education. Vocational preparation. The word work does not appear consistently in the inspection record to describe what the boys were doing inside the compound. This raises a question about how the inspection process functioned in relation to language. If an institution describes an activity as training, and an inspector observes that activity and records it as training, the categorization has been accepted without independent evaluation. The inspector is not independently assessing whether what they are observing meets the definition of training or the definition of productive labor. They are accepting and replicating the institution's own framing. Self-sufficiency as a concept has an internal logic that makes it difficult to challenge on the surface. A community that produces what it needs is not obviously doing something wrong. Farming communities, religious orders, and intentional communities of various kinds have operated on self-sufficiency principles throughout history without controversy. The concept itself carries positive associations. Independence, resourcefulness, reduced dependence on external systems. When applied to an institution housing vulnerable children, it also carries an additional implication. The institution is not burdening the public with its operational costs. It is managing its own affairs. That implication was useful in the context of government funding negotiations because it positioned the institution as a responsible steward of the grants it received. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The self-sufficiency model at Artane was built entirely on the labor of the children inside it. Remove the children's labor from the equation, and the model does not function. The food does not get grown. The shoes do not get stitched. The printing press does not operate. The self-sufficiency that the institution presented as an achievement was not an achievement of the institution's management or the religious brothers who supervised the compound. It was an achievement of the nearly 1,000 boys who performed the labor that made it possible. The institution received credit for the outcome. The boys received no acknowledgement of the contribution, and the word used to describe the arrangement ensured that the contribution remained invisible by categorizing it as something other than what it economically was. The printing press deserves particular attention because it is the element of Artane's operation that moves most clearly beyond any plausible definition of self-sufficiency. A printing press producing material for internal institutional use is a self-sufficiency measure. A printing press producing material that leaves the compound and enters the external market is a commercial operation. The records indicate that Artane's press produced material for both purposes. The line between the two functions is not always clearly drawn in the surviving documentation, but the existence of external production that generated revenue from outside buyers, is documented in sources that researchers have located in Irish archival collections. The press was not simply printing schedules and prayer books for internal use. It was printing material that was sold, and the revenue from those sales went to the institution, not to the boys operating the press. Some historians argue that the self-sufficiency model at Artane should be understood in the context of the Christian Brothers' broader educational philosophy. The brothers believed, and stated this in their own educational writings, that practical labor was an essential component of genuine formation. Boys who worked alongside their academic and religious education were, in this philosophy, receiving a more complete preparation for life than boys who studied in isolation from practical activity. The labor was not incidental to the educational mission. It was central to it. This argument has been made by defenders of the institution and, more carefully, by historians attempting to understand the institution on its own terms before evaluating it. Others find the argument insufficient. They point to the scale of production, the revenue it generated, and the complete absence of any compensation or acknowledgement for the boys involved as evidence that the educational framing was functioning as a cover for something that operated economically as labor extraction regardless of the philosophy attached to it. However, the timeline does not fully match the educational framing in a specific and documentable way. Genuine educational programs have defined outcomes. A boy learning farming should eventually demonstrate competence and move on from the learning stage to the applying stage. The same is true of printing, shoemaking, and any other practical skill. But the records from Artane do not show boys moving through defined stages of skill acquisition toward a credentialed outcome. They show boys performing the same productive tasks year after year, contributing to the same operational outputs, with no formal recognition of skill development and no transition to independent application of the skills they had supposedly acquired. The educational framing describes a process with a direction. The operational reality described in the records looks more like a continuous productive arrangement without a defined endpoint for any individual participant. The boys who passed through Artane and later gave testimony to government investigations described the daily reality of the compound in terms that are consistent with the documentary record, but that added dimension the official documents do not capture. They describe schedules organized around productive tasks. They describe moving between agricultural work, workshop production, and classroom time in patterns determined entirely by institutional need rather than individual educational progress. They describe producing goods that left the compound in quantities they could observe, but whose destination and value they were never told. The gap between what they were told they were receiving, an education, and what the compound's records show they were providing, organized productive labor at institutional scale, is consistent across many individual accounts and across the documentary evidence. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. An institution that describes its operation as educational while simultaneously generating revenue from its residents' productive labor, filing reports using educational language with government bodies that fund it on that basis, and providing no compensation, credential, or documented skill outcome to the individuals whose labor sustains the operation, is describing itself in terms that do not match its economic function. That mismatch was present in the documentation throughout nearly a century of Artane's operation. The institution filed reports. The government read them. The inspectors visited. The word education appeared consistently, and the surplus from the farmland and the printing press and the shoe workshop continued to generate revenue that the boys never saw, and the reports never itemized in terms of what the children's contribution had actually been worth. The word self-sufficient covered all of it. It described an outcome and implied a virtue. What it did not describe was the source of that outcome, or what the source was owed in return. One of the things that makes this subject difficult to dismiss as a regional or cultural phenomenon is the geography of the pattern itself. If the industrial institution model had appeared in one country, it could be explained as a product of specific local conditions, a particular government policy, a specific religious tradition, a unique economic pressure that produced an unusual response. But the model did not appear in one country. It appeared across multiple countries on multiple continents during the same historical period, with architectural and operational features that were consistent enough to suggest something more than independent parallel development. That consistency is what raises the structural questions that individual institutional histories cannot answer on their own. The Schneller Orphanage in Jerusalem is a useful example precisely because it sits outside the Irish and British institutional traditions that most historical accounts focus on. It was founded by a German Lutheran missionary in the mid-19th century and expanded steadily over the following decades. By 1903, it had grown into a compound of 8 separate buildings, surrounded by high stone walls, with iron gates that were locked every night. The locking of the gates is a detail worth holding. Gates that are locked every night are not primarily keeping the outside world from entering. They are primarily preventing those inside from leaving. The distinction matters when the people inside are children who have no legal capacity to leave on their own authority regardless of whether the gates are locked or not. The operational profile of the Schneller compound by 1903 was extensive. The institution ran its own printing press, its own bakery, its own flour mill, its own laundry, its own carpentry shop, its own pottery factory, and its own brick kiln. 8 distinct productive operations inside a single-walled compound. The range of production at Schneller goes well beyond anything that could be described as self-sufficiency in the sense of meeting internal needs. A compound housing children does not require a brick kiln to feed and shelter those children. It does not require a pottery factory. It does not require a carpentry shop producing at the scale that a dedicated workshop implies. These are productive operations oriented toward external markets. They produce goods that leave the compound, and the children inside the compound provided the labor that made those operations function. The word used in institutional communications to describe this arrangement was, again, training. At first, It seems normal to find similar institutions in different parts of the world during the same historical period. The 19th century was an era of rapid global communication. Ideas traveled through missionary networks, through government correspondence, through international charitable organizations that maintain connections across national borders. If a particular institutional model proved effective at raising donations and securing government support in one country, it is not surprising that similar models appeared elsewhere. Institutional designs get borrowed. Administrative frameworks get adapted. The spread of the industrial institution model across multiple countries could reflect nothing more than the normal diffusion of ideas through existing networks. But there's a problem with that explanation when applied to the specific features of the model that appeared most consistently. The walled perimeter appears in Dublin and in Jerusalem. The combination of residential function with commercial production appears in Limerick and in Melbourne. The presentable front entrance with documented public spaces appears in Philadelphia and in Manchester. The unlisted rear buildings, where operational activity took place, appear across the institutional record regardless of country or religious tradition. These are not general features of large residential institutions. They are specific design choices, and their consistent appearance across institutions, with no direct administrative connection to each other, suggests that the choices were being made in response to the same set of requirements, whether those requirements were stated explicitly or simply understood by the people building these compounds. In Pittsburgh, in Manchester, in Melbourne, researchers examining local institutional records found the same basic layout described in documents from Dublin and Jerusalem. A main building facing a public street. Additional structures behind it connected by internal passages. A wall or fence defining the compound perimeter. Productive operations housed in the rear structures that did not appear in the public-facing documentation of the institution's activities. The local details varied. The building materials reflected local availability. The specific trades practiced inside the walls reflected local economic conditions. But the fundamental arrangement, the relationship between the visible front and the operational rear, appeared with a consistency that the independent parallel development explanation struggles to account for fully. The English factory connection introduces a dimension of the pattern that moves the analysis beyond institutional self-description and into documented commercial transaction. In England, the relationship between children's institutions and industrial employers was not informal or indirect. It was a formal economic arrangement recorded in contracts and payment records that survive in both institutional and commercial archives. Factory owners paid workhouses and orphanages a fixed sum for each child delivered to their facilities. The payment was made at the point of transfer. The child left the institution. The factory received the child. The institution received the money. This transaction was not hidden. It was documented in the records of both parties. George Courtaulds' silk mill provides one of the most precisely documented examples of this arrangement. The mill paid £5 upon receiving a child from an institution. It then paid an additional £5 after the child had completed 1 year of labor at the mill. The two-payment structure is significant. The first payment secured the transfer. The second payment, contingent on 1 year of completed labor, created an incentive for the mill to retain the child through that first year regardless of conditions. A child who left before the year was complete represented a financial loss to the mill. The structure of the payment incentivized retention, and the children involved had no legal standing to leave independently. They had signed contracts, or more precisely, contracts had been signed on their behalf. But this is where it becomes unclear. The children who entered these mill contracts could not read the documents that bound them. They were children. Many of them had received limited formal education inside the institutions that surrendered them. The contract was a legal instrument that committed them to labor until the age of 21. It was signed not by the child, but by the institution acting on the child's behalf. The institution that signed the contract was the same institution that received the £5 transfer payment. The institution was therefore simultaneously the child's legal guardian, the party receiving payment for the child's transfer, and the entity whose signature made the contract legally binding. The child's interests and the institution's financial interests in that transaction were not aligned, but the institution held all the authority. The wage comparison documented in factory records from the same period makes the economic structure of these arrangements visible in precise numerical terms. Adult male workers at Courtaulds silk mill earned over 7 shillings per week. Children under 11 at the same mill received 1 shilling and 5 pence per week. The ratio between adult and child wages at this mill was not unusual for the period. Child labor was systematically undercompensated relative to adult labor across the 19th century industrial economy. But the children arriving from institutions faced an additional layer in this structure. The institution had already received a purchase payment for delivering them. Whatever the child earned at the mill, the institution had already extracted a separate payment from the transaction before the child began working. The child's labor was monetized twice. Once at the point of transfer, once through the reduced wage paid during years of mill employment. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The contracts binding children until age 21 were filed with public authorities. The payment records documenting transfer fees were held in commercial archives that government inspectors could in principle have accessed. The wage differentials between adult and child workers were visible in mill payroll records. None of this information was concealed in the sense of being held in secret locations or encoded in obscure language. It existed in documented form in records that were, at least theoretically, available for examination. The question of why this documented economic structure did not generate sustained governmental scrutiny during the decades it operated is one that the historical record does not answer cleanly. Some historians argue that the answer lies in the assumptions of the period. Child labor was so normalized across all levels of 19th century society that the specific arrangements involving institutionalized children did not stand out as unusual. Factory work was understood as a legitimate outcome for children of the laboring classes, whether those children came from family households or institutional ones. The transfer payment was understood as reimbursement to the institution for the cost of raising the child to working age. The reduced wage was understood as reflecting the child's limited productive capacity relative to adults. Each element of the arrangement had an explanation that fit within the prevailing assumptions of the era. Others find this argument insufficient. They point to the systematic nature of the arrangements, the consistent payment structures, the binding contracts, and the transfer pipelines as evidence of something more deliberate than simply normalized practice. However, the timeline does not fully match the normalization argument in one specific respect. Adult labor reform movements were active and vocal throughout the same period when these institutional transfer arrangements were operating. Debates about working conditions, wages, and the rights of laborers were occurring in the same parliamentary chambers that were also receiving inspection reports about children's institutions. The political environment was not one of complete indifference to labor conditions. Reform was being discussed and in some areas implemented. The children arriving from institutions at mills like Courtaulds were working in an economy that was actively debating labor rights. But those debates did not consistently extend to the specific population of institutionalized children moving through transfer arrangements. That population remained outside the frame of labor reform in ways that workers' children in family households did not. The pattern that emerges from Jerusalem, from Pittsburgh, from Manchester, from Melbourne, and from the English factory records is not a collection of unrelated local stories. It is a consistent operational model appearing across different countries, different religious traditions, different legal systems, and different economic contexts. The walled compound, the productive operations behind the presentable entrance, the transfer of children into commercial employment through formal financial arrangements, the legal instruments binding those children to labor they had no capacity to refuse or negotiate. These features appear together, repeatedly, across the documented record of this period. Whether that consistency reflects coordinated design, shared institutional knowledge, or the independent convergence of organizations responding to the same economic incentives is a question the available records raise clearly, but do not resolve completely. The pattern is visible. Its origins remain genuinely unclear. At a certain point in this research, the subject matter shifts, not dramatically, not into a different topic, but into territory that is harder to place alongside the labor records and the financial structures and the architectural layouts that have been examined so far. The labor question has a clear economic logic. The funding model has a traceable incentive structure. The compound architecture has a documentable physical reality. Those elements connect to each other through a recognizable framework of institutional self-interest and financial calculation. What comes next does not sit as cleanly within that framework, but it operates on a principle that, once identified, is not difficult to recognize. It is the principle of a population that cannot refuse. To understand why that principle matters in this context, it helps to think about what medical research requires. Research involving human subjects requires access to those subjects. It requires the ability to administer a substance, observe a response, and document the results over a defined period. It requires subjects who remain in a controlled environment for the duration of the study. And in the early decades of the 20th century, before formal ethical frameworks governing human research existed, it also required subjects who would not or could not object to the procedures being performed on them. Children living inside walled institutional compounds, with no parent present, no legal advocate, and no independent access to information about what was being done to them, met all of those requirements simultaneously. In 1908, researchers working in Philadelphia conducted a study involving children at St. Vincent Orphanage. The study involved the administration of tuberculin, a substance derived from tuberculosis bacteria, to dozens of children inside the institution. Tuberculin testing was a developing area of medical research at the time. The question of how the human body responded to tuberculin under various conditions was considered scientifically relevant. The children at St. Vincent provided a population that could be administered the substance and observed in a controlled residential setting. The results of the study documented outcomes that included permanent blindness in some of the children involved. Others developed painful chronic lesions and long-term inflammation. These outcomes were not hidden from the medical community. They appeared in the published record of the research. What did not appear in that record was any documentation of consent obtained from the children or from any adult acting on their behalf. The following year, a researcher at a different Philadelphia orphanage conducted a separate study. This one involved the deliberate infection of 2 children with a skin virus. The researcher's own published paper, which survives in medical archive collections, contains a detail that is difficult to interpret charitably. The paper states that the disease mechanisms being studied were already well understood before the experiment was conducted. The researcher infected 2 children with a virus in order to confirm findings that existing medical literature had already established. The experiment was not filling a gap in scientific knowledge. It was replicating what textbooks had already documented, using children as the subjects of that replication. The published paper does not discuss consent. It does not discuss whether the children or any adult responsible for them was informed of the procedure or its potential effects. It presents the methodology and the results as though the selection of institutionalized children as subjects required no explanation. At first, it seems like an isolated incident. 2 cases in Philadelphia in 2 consecutive years. Disturbing individually, but perhaps not indicative of a broader pattern. But there's a problem with that reading. When researchers began examining medical literature from the same period across other countries, the Philadelphia cases were not isolated. They were examples of a practice that appears in the documented record across multiple countries and across multiple decades. The use of children in institutional care as subjects for medical research was not a local anomaly. It was a recurring feature of how certain types of research were conducted during this period, and the institutions that made it possible were not acting outside their normal operational parameters when they permitted it. They were extending the same logic that governed their relationship to children's labor into the domain of medical research. The children were a resource. The resource was available. The question of what the children themselves wanted or understood was not consistently part of the calculation. In Ireland, the documentation of medical research conducted on institutionalized children comes from a specific and well-defined period. Between 1930 and 1936, more than 2,000 children living in religious-run homes received an experimental diphtheria vaccine manufactured by Burroughs Wellcome. Diphtheria was a serious public health concern during this period. Research into effective vaccines was considered genuinely important medical work. Those facts are not in dispute. What is in dispute, or more precisely, what the available records fail to establish, is whether anyone sought consent for the administration of this experimental vaccine to more than 2,000 children. The historian Michael Dwyer, who investigated these trials and published his findings, found no evidence that consent was ever sought from any parent. No records survive documenting what, if any, adverse effects the children experienced. No records document whether any children died following administration of the experimental vaccine. But this is where it becomes unclear. The trials were not conducted in secret in the sense of being hidden from the medical community. The results were published in prestigious medical journals. Researchers in Ireland and internationally had access to the findings. The trials were peer-reviewed and entered the scientific literature as legitimate research. What they were not was disclosed to the Irish public. The families of the children involved were not informed that their children had participated in a vaccine trial. The children themselves were not informed. The religious institutions that housed the children permitted the trials to proceed without any documented process of informing or consulting the people most directly affected. The research was public in one direction, toward the scientific community, and completely invisible in another direction, toward the children and families it involved. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The gap between the openness of the research in medical publications and the complete absence of disclosure to the children and families involved is not a gap that can be explained by the standards of the era alone. Informed consent as a formal legal requirement did not exist in the 1930s in the form it takes today. That is accurate, but the concept that people being subjected to medical procedures should be aware of and agree to those procedures was not entirely absent from medical thinking during this period either. It existed in principle, even when it was inconsistently applied in practice. The question of why that principle was applied so differently to institutionalized children than to other populations is one that the era's general standards do not fully resolve. In Australia, the pattern continued into the post-war decades. Between 1945 and 1970, vaccine trials were conducted on babies at 5 institutional homes. This time period is significant. By the mid-20th century, the international medical community had experienced and responded to some of the most disturbing cases of unethical human experimentation in history. Discussions about the ethical requirements for human research were ongoing in medical and governmental bodies during this period, and yet the Australian trials proceeded. A government report examining those trials later concluded that consent had been obtained only from institutional staff, not from parents. In many cases, the children involved had no identifiable parents who could have been contacted. In others, parents existed but were not consulted. The staff of the institutions gave consent on behalf of children who were not their children for procedures the children could not understand, with consequences that were by definition unknown because the substances being administered were experimental. Some researchers who have examined the medical trial records argue that the researchers involved genuinely believed they were conducting important work that would benefit public health, including the health of the very population they were testing on. Diphtheria and other diseases they were researching killed children in significant numbers during these decades. Developing effective vaccines was a legitimate and urgent scientific goal. The researchers were not, in this reading, indifferent to the welfare of the children they were studying. They were operating within the research norms of their period, which did not require the same consent processes that are now considered essential. Others find this framing insufficient. They point to the researcher in Philadelphia who admitted in his own paper that his experiment confirmed only what textbooks had already established. That admission removes the justification of urgent scientific necessity. It leaves only the question of why children in an institution were selected as subjects for research that served no purpose that could not have been served in other ways. However, the timeline does not fully match a purely era-specific explanation across the full documented span of these trials. The earliest documented case of experimentation on institutionalized children in the available record dates to 1803 in Australia, when an assistant surgeon tested a smallpox vaccine on orphans with the written permission of a colonial governor. The practice then continued, in documented form, for more than 160 years before any regulation specifically restricting the use of institutionalized children as research subjects was passed. 160 years is not a product of a single era's norms. It spans multiple generations, multiple shifts in medical ethics, multiple periods of public debate about human research. The persistence of the practice across that span suggests something more durable than simple adherence to the assumptions of any particular decade. The connection between the labor question and the research question is not one of equivalence. They are not the same violation. The experience of a child performing uncompensated labor is different from the experience of a child being administered an experimental substance. The harms involved are different. The mechanisms are different. But the underlying condition that made both possible is the same. Children inside these institutions had no advocate outside the institution's walls who was monitoring their daily experience and capable of objecting to what was being done to them. No parent present. No independent legal representative. No external body with both the information and the authority to intervene. The institution held complete authority over the children's daily lives, and that authority extended, in documented cases, to permitting their use in medical research without any process of consent or disclosure to the children themselves. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The absence of an advocate is not simply a gap in a welfare system. It is a structural condition that fundamentally alters the power relationship between the children and every adult institution that interacts with them. A child with a present and informed parent has someone who can ask questions, refuse procedures, and demand explanations. A child inside a walled compound with no such person in their life has no one performing those functions. The researchers who selected institutionalized children as subjects were not selecting them randomly from the general population. They were selecting them specifically because of the conditions of their institutional life. The absence of advocacy was not incidental to the selection. It was, in the documented cases, the reason for it. A population that cannot refuse is a population that certain kinds of research require, and the institutions that housed these children had, for reasons that the labor records and the financial structures have already outlined, built exactly that kind of population over many decades of operation. When researchers reach this point in the historical record, they tend to divide into two broad interpretive camps, not because the facts themselves are in dispute. The documents exist. The financial records survive. The architectural surveys are available. The transfer patterns between institutions are traceable in admission and discharge records that government investigations have now examined in detail. The facts, to the extent that they are recoverable, are not the source of disagreement. The disagreement is about what those facts mean when placed together, whether they describe a system that was deliberately built to function the way it functioned, or whether they describe a system that simply evolved into that shape through the accumulation of individual decisions made under historical pressures that nobody fully controlled. The first interpretation, held by a significant number of researchers who have studied this period in depth, begins with the interlocking nature of the institutions themselves. This is not a metaphor. It is a structural description. In Ireland, the institutions that housed children and the institutions that employed adult women were not separate organizations operating independently in the same general field of charitable work. They were components of the same organizational system, managed by the same religious congregations, operating on the same or adjacent physical sites, and connected by documented transfer pipelines that moved individuals from one institutional category to another at predictable life stage transitions. A girl entered the industrial school as a child. She remained inside the walled compound through her formative years. When she reached the age at which the industrial school's mandate ended, she did not enter the general workforce or return to a family network. She transferred, directly and in documented cases systematically, into the Magdalene laundry attached to the same religious compound that had housed her since childhood. The economic logic of this arrangement is traceable in the surviving financial records of these institutions. The orphanage or industrial school received government funding for each child it housed. That funding covered the operational costs of maintaining the children's facility. The Magdalene laundry, operating as a commercial washing service for external clients, generated revenue from the labor of the women working inside it. Those women received no wage. The revenue they generated went to the religious congregation, managing both facilities. The congregation therefore received government money from one part of the operation and commercial revenue from the other. The children supplied by the first institution became the unpaid workforce of the second. The financial flow moved through the congregation in a closed loop. One historian who examined this arrangement in detail described it as a massive interlocking system, carefully and painstakingly built up over a number of decades. That description appears in published academic work and has not been seriously challenged on factual grounds. What has been challenged is the implication that the system was deliberately engineered rather than gradually assembled. The deliberate engineering argument rests on several observations that its proponents consider difficult to explain through gradual evolution alone. The first is the physical integration of the different institutional functions. The industrial school and the laundry at the Good Shepherd compound in Limerick were not located near each other. They were connected to each other by underground passages. That level of physical integration requires architectural planning. It does not emerge accidentally. Somebody designed the connection between the children's building and the commercial laundry. Somebody commissioned the construction of passages linking them. The decision to build those connections was made before the concrete was poured, not after the institutions happened to find themselves adjacent. Physical integration of that kind reflects prior intention, not subsequent coincidence. But this is where it becomes unclear. The deliberate engineering argument, while coherent in its structural observations, faces a significant evidential challenge. Engineering a system across multiple countries simultaneously requires coordination. It requires communication between the parties involved. It requires either a central directing authority or a shared set of instructions that different organizations in different countries were all following. And the historical record does not clearly identify that central coordinating authority or those shared instructions. Religious congregations did maintain international networks of communication during this period. The Catholic religious orders that managed the majority of these institutions in Ireland, England, Australia, and elsewhere operated under central organizational structures that crossed national borders. Communication between Irish and Australian branches of the same congregation was possible and documented in general terms. But the specific question of whether those networks transmitted instructions about institutional design, about the connection between children's facilities and adult labor operations, is not something the surviving records answer directly. The second interpretation, which also has serious scholarly support, begins from the same factual base, but reaches a different conclusion about its meaning. Poverty was real and severe during the period when these institutions were established. Government capacity to address that poverty was genuinely limited. Religious organizations had infrastructure, personnel drawn from religious orders who required no salary in the conventional sense, and established donor relationships that gave them financial resources governments lacked. When these organizations built institutions to house poor children, they were responding to a visible crisis with the tools available to them. The industrial training model made sense within the values of the era. Per-child government funding made sense as an administrative mechanism. The attachment of laundry operations to residential compounds made sense as a way to generate revenue that could offset operational costs. Each individual decision in this reading was a rational response to a specific practical problem. The system that resulted from many such decisions was not the product of a plan. It was the product of pragmatism accumulating over time. This interpretation has its own explanatory strengths. It accounts for the variation in the system across different countries and different religious traditions. If the model had been centrally designed and distributed, one might expect greater uniformity in its specific features. What the historical record shows is consistency in the broad structural elements alongside significant variation in the details. The walled perimeter appears everywhere. The combination of residential and productive functions appears everywhere. But the specific trades practiced, the specific arrangements for government funding, and the specific legal frameworks governing the institutions varied considerably by country and by period. That variation is more consistent with independent development than with centrally coordinated design. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Both interpretations have genuine explanatory power, and both leave questions unanswered that their own frameworks cannot resolve. The gradual evolution argument explains the variation in details across countries, but it struggles to account for the precision of the structural similarities. The walled perimeter is not a generic feature of large residential buildings. It is a specific design choice with specific functional implications for the movement and control of residents. Its consistent appearance across institutions, with no documented direct connection, is a fact that the coincidence of parallel development explains less convincingly than the deliberate engineering argument does. The deliberate engineering argument explains the structural similarities, but it struggles to identify the mechanism by which identical structural choices were transmitted across national borders and between organizations with different religious affiliations and different governmental relationships. If the design was engineered, the engineering required communication. The communication should have left traces. Some traces exist in the general records of religious congregation networks, but the specific traces that would confirm deliberate coordination of institutional design across countries have not been located in the available archives. Their absence does not prove the coordination did not occur. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in cases where records have been selectively preserved or deliberately destroyed. But it does mean the deliberate engineering argument rests on structural inference rather than direct documentary proof. The founding charters add a layer to this question that neither interpretation has fully resolved. When researchers compare the founding charters of institutions in Dublin, Philadelphia, Melbourne, and Jerusalem, they find language that is not merely similar in its general intent. It is identical in specific phrases, the same constructions, the same descriptions of institutional purpose, the same frameworks for the relationship between the institution, the government, and the children being housed. Language does not become identical across independent documents produced in different countries by different authors without some mechanism of transmission. Either those authors were working from a shared source document, or they were in direct communication with each other, or the language traveled through some intermediary channel that the surviving records have not yet identified. The identical language is a fact. The explanation for it remains open. Some researchers have looked to the International Charitable Conference networks of the 19th century as a possible transmission mechanism. Organizations working in child welfare, prison reform, and institutional care met regularly at international conferences during this period. Published proceedings from those conferences survive in library collections. Those proceedings show that institutional models and administrative practices were discussed and shared across national delegations. The possibility that the industrial institution model, including its architectural features and financial structures, was distributed through these conference networks is plausible. But plausible is not the same as documented. The conference proceedings discuss principles and outcomes. They do not consistently describe the physical design specifications of the compounds whose results were being reported. However, the timeline does not fully match a purely organic evolution story in one specific and important respect. The industrial institution model appeared in its mature form, with walled compounds, multiple connected structures, and combined residential and commercial functions, within a relatively compressed historical window in the mid-19th century. If the model had evolved gradually through independent experimentation in different countries, one would expect to find earlier, simpler versions in the documentary record before the mature compound model appeared. What the founding charters and early institutional records show is the mature model appearing relatively fully formed in its essential features from an early date. That pattern is more consistent with the adoption of an existing design than with the independent invention of a new one. Where the design originated before it appeared in these institutions is a question the available records do not yet answer. The Magdalene laundry connection remains the clearest single example of the interlocking structure that the deliberate engineering argument points to. The physical connection between the children's institution and the adult labor facility. The documented transfer of individuals from one to the other at life stage transitions. The financial flow that moved government funding and commercial revenue through the same organizational entity. These are not features that emerged accidentally from two institutions that happened to occupy adjacent sites. They are features of a single integrated system that happened to be described using two different institutional labels. Whether that integration was planned from the beginning or assembled gradually through successive decisions that each made sense in isolation is the question that sits at the center of both interpretations. And the honest answer, based on what the available records currently show, is that both possibilities remain open. The system existed, its structure is documented, its origins, and the degree to which that structure was intentional, remain genuinely unclear. In 2012, a local historian in County Galway began a research project that she funded entirely from her own pocket. Her name was Catherine Corliss. She was not a government investigator. She was not a journalist working for a major publication. She was not attached to a university research department with institutional funding and administrative support. She was a local historian with an interest in the history of her community, and she had noticed something that the official record of her town did not adequately explain. Children had died at the St. Mary's Mother and Baby Home in Chewham. She knew this in a general sense from local memory and fragmentary references in existing historical sources. What she did not know, and what she set out to establish with documentary precision, was how many children and what had happened to them after they died. The method she used was straightforward. She requested death certificates from the relevant civil registration authorities. Each certificate cost €4. She paid for them herself, from her personal savings, because no institution, no government department, and no religious organization had ever made the same request before her. That fact deserves to be held for a moment before moving past it. The St. Mary's Mother and Baby Home in Chewham operated from 1925 to 1961. It was a state-funded institution run by the Bon Secours Sisters, a Catholic religious congregation. It received government money specifically designated for the care of the mothers and children housed inside it. It operated under the oversight of local government and church authorities for 36 years. And in all that time, across all those decades of operation and the subsequent decades after its closure, nobody with institutional authority had ever requested the death certificates of the children who died there. Catherine Corliss was the first person to ask. What she found when those certificates arrived, one by one at €4 each, was a number: 796. That was the count of children named on death certificates identifying the Chewham home as the place of death. 796 individual deaths documented in civil records that had been sitting in government archives, accessible to anyone willing to pay the fee, for decades. The certificates were not hidden. They were not classified. They were public records available through a standard administrative request. They had simply never been requested by anyone who then compared them against burial records to ask where the children named on them had been interred. When Catherine Corliss made that comparison, she found a gap that the official record could not explain. None of the 796 children appeared in the burial records of any public cemetery in Chewham or the surrounding area. In a town where deaths are recorded and burials are documented, 796 children had death certificates and no corresponding burial records. They had died. That was established. Where their remains were located was not established by any existing official documentation. The question of where 796 children were buried after dying in a state-funded institution was not a question that any government body, any religious organization, or any local authority had apparently considered worth answering in the decades between the home's closure in 1961 and Catherine Corliss's research in 2012. At first, it seems like a record-keeping gap of the kind that historical research frequently encounters. Burial records from this period are incomplete across many institutions and many communities. The administrative standards of earlier decades were not consistent. Documents were lost, damaged, or simply never created. That explanation is available and has been offered, but there is a problem with applying it here. The death certificates existed. They had been properly filed with civil authorities and preserved in government archives. The deaths were documented. It was specifically the burials that were unrecorded. That asymmetry, careful documentation of death, and complete absence of burial records is not typical of ordinary record-keeping gaps. Ordinary gaps affect both types of records. What the Chewham case shows is documentation on one side of the event and complete silence on the other. In 2017, 5 years after Catherine Corliss published her initial findings, a government-commissioned excavation of the former Chewham home site confirmed what the missing burial records had left open as a question. Human remains were found. They were located inside a disused sewage structure on the grounds of the former institution. The structure had been part of the site's original infrastructure, built when the home was established. It had been decommissioned at some point during the institution's operation and was no longer functioning as a sewage system by the time the remains were placed there, or during the period when the children whose remains it contained had died. The excavation confirmed the presence of remains belonging to infants and young children. The ages of the individuals whose remains were recovered were consistent with the ages of children named on the death certificates Catherine Corliss had collected. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The location of the remains inside a decommissioned sewage structure is a fact that the available record does not explain. It is not explained in the Bon Secours sisters' public statements. It is not explained in the government reports that preceded the excavation. The structure was on the institutional grounds. The children whose remains it contained had died inside the institution. The connection between the two facts is physical and documented. The explanation for why that particular structure became the location where those children's remains were placed is not documented in any record that has been made publicly available. The Bon Secours sisters, when the findings became public, initially engaged a public relations firm. The firm's response disputed the characterization of the site as a mass grave. Catherine Corliss had already published the death certificates. The remains had already been confirmed by government excavation. The dispute about characterization did not address the underlying question of why the children were there. In December 2025, a second burial site was discovered at the Chewham location. It was located 50 to 100 meters from the original confirmed site. No surface marker of any kind had ever indicated its existence. No record in any institutional, government, or religious archive had documented it. It was found during the ongoing excavation process, in a location that had not been identified as significant by any prior survey of the site. The discovery of a second site, in a location that the excavation team had not specifically targeted, raises a question about the completeness of the current understanding of the Chewham grounds. If two sites have now been confirmed, and the second was discovered without any prior documentary indication of its existence, the question of how many additional unrecorded sites may exist within the former institutional grounds is one that the excavation is still in the process of answering. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. An excavation that discovers significant finds in locations not previously identified as significant is an excavation operating in an evidential environment where the documentary record is incomplete as a guide to the physical reality of the site. The ground may contain more than the documents describe, and the documents, in the case of Chewham and the institutions connected to it, have already demonstrated their incompleteness in specific and consequential ways. The death certificates existed but were never requested. The burial sites existed but were never recorded. The sewage structure contained remains, but no record described its use for that purpose. Each of these gaps in the documentary record was discovered not through institutional disclosure, but through independent research and physical excavation. The pattern of discovery through external inquiry, rather than institutional transparency, is consistent across every element of the Chewham case. The mortality rate at the Chewham home is a figure that contextualizes the 796 deaths in a way that the raw number alone does not fully convey. Across Ireland's mother and baby homes during the period from 1922 to 1998, approximately 9,000 children died. That figure comes from government investigations that examined institutional records alongside civil registration data. 9,000 deaths across the full network of institutions over that period. The national infant mortality rate for the same period, applied to the same population size, would predict a fraction of that number. The mortality rate inside these institutions was approximately 5 times the national average for comparable age groups during the same decades. These institutions received government funding specifically designated for the care of the children inside them. The funding was justified on the basis that the institutions were providing care that the children's families could not. The mortality rate suggests that the outcome of that funded care was substantially worse than what children in the general population experienced without institutional intervention. Some researchers note that the elevated mortality rate reflects the conditions of admission rather than the conditions of care. Children entering mother and baby homes were frequently born to mothers in difficult circumstances, without access to the prenatal care and nutritional support that would have been available to women in more stable situations. The children were already at elevated risk before they arrived. Others disagree with the sufficiency of that explanation. They point to specific institutions where mortality rates were dramatically higher than the already elevated network average, and where the conditions documented by survivors and investigators cannot be attributed to pre-admission risk factors alone. The mortality rate at CHUM specifically was among the highest in the documented network. Nearly 1 in 4 children who entered that home did not survive to leave it. That figure, applied to a state-funded institution receiving grants for child welfare, raises questions that pre-admission risk factors alone cannot resolve. However, the timeline does not fully match a simple resource scarcity explanation either. The peak decades of mortality at these institutions overlap with decades during which government funding for them was available and being paid. The institutions were not operating without resources. They were operating with government grants, with donations from religious organization networks, and in some cases, with revenue from commercial operations attached to their facilities. The question of where those resources went and why the mortality rates remained so dramatically elevated above the national average, despite the availability of funding, is one that the financial records of the institutions, where those records survive, do not answer transparently. The records question is itself a significant part of what the CHUM case reveals about the broader institutional system. The records from Artane Industrial School remain fragmentary after decades of selective preservation. The records of the Fisheries School in Baltimore, West Cork, were deliberately destroyed, according to findings from government investigators. The files from Golden Bridge are incomplete in ways that prevent a full accounting of the population it housed and the outcomes those individuals experienced. The pattern of missing, incomplete, and destroyed records is not uniform across all institutions. Some records survive in reasonable condition, but the records that are most consistently absent or incomplete are the records that would be most useful for understanding what happened to specific individuals inside specific institutions. Admission records, discharge records, medical records, death records that correspond to the death certificates filed with civil authorities. These are precisely the records that Catherine Corliss found missing when she compared death certificates against burial documentation. Catherine Corliss paid €3,184 of her own money to purchase the death certificates that documented 796 children. That calculation, the total cost of the certificates that first established the scale of what had happened at CHUM, appears in the published accounts of her research. It is a precise and specific figure that carries an implication the broader institutional history makes difficult to dismiss. The cost of requesting those certificates was not prohibitive for a government body, a religious congregation, or a funded research institution. For euros per certificate is an administrative fee, not a barrier. The certificates were available. The process for requesting them was standard. The information they contained was accessible to anyone who asked. For decades after the CHUM home closed, nobody asked. The gap between what was available and what was requested is not a gap explained by cost or administrative difficulty. It is a gap that requires a different kind of explanation. And that explanation, whatever it is, sits in the same space as the concrete-filled tunnels in Limerick, the destroyed records in Baltimore, and the unnamed rear buildings that appear in institutional compounds across Ireland, England, America, and Australia. The information existed. The question of why it remained unexamined for so long is one that the documentary record, even now, does not fully answer. The excavation at CHUM continues. The ground is still being examined, and what it contains, in locations that no document anticipated, is still being determined.